Good morning and welcome. For those of you new to the Napa Summer Conference, my name's Fran Maier. I'm a senior fellow with the Ethics and Public Policy Center and also a Napa Institute board member. This is an early session, but I think you'll find that it's very much worth your while. For anyone concerned about the direction of American culture, Carl Trueman's best-selling book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, published by Crossway in October 2020, is an essential read. It's beautifully written, it's engaging, and it makes sense in a very powerful way of our current moral and cultural confusion. But it's also a serious 425 pages long. So earlier this year, Carl published a shorter, more popular version of his thoughts covering and updating much of the same material. Its title is Strange New World: How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. It's also published by Crossway. It's also a terrific read, and it's the trigger of our conversation this morning, anchored by the author Carl Trueman and Aaron Kheriaty. I interviewed this book just earlier this week at the Catholic thing, and basically boiling it down, this has all the protein, half the carbs, and it's the same great taste. So this is what it looks like. Carl Trueman is a graduate of the Universities of Cambridge and Aberdeen, professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College, the author of too many articles, books, and lectures to count, a former fellow of Princeton University's James Madison program, and a fellow in the Evangelicals and Civic Life program at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is currently Chief of Psychiatry, look out folks, this is scary, Chief of Psychiatry and Ethics at Doc One Health and Chief of Medical Ethics at the Unity Project. He's a fellow and director of the program in Bioethics and American Democracy at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I'm sure some of you heard him speak last night. It was a terrific presentation. He's also author of the forthcoming book, another one that will be essential reading, due out this October from Regnery, The New Abnormal: The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. The process this morning is going to be very simple. Carl and Aaron will each speak for about 8 or 10 minutes, and then we have folks here who will be coming around to give the microphone to people who want to ask questions. And then at 9:15 sharp, I'll pull the plug. So with that, Carl, it's all yours.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you all this morning. Thanks for turning out so early. And first of all, I think it's appropriate to thank Fran for organizing this and being willing to chair it. I think my wife would agree that over the last 5 years, Fran has probably been the most significant mentor and friend in my life through thick and thin. So it's a real privilege to be sharing a platform with him.
Presbyterian.
No, the Presbyterians hate me. That's the so. No, I just wanted to briefly give some background to the book and then offer a few thoughts on what I hope the book will achieve. The original background for the book emerged in about 2015, 2016, when I became sort of radicalized. I am by training a Reformation historian. It's sort of to describe my work in geeky terms. The latter part of my interest was the reception, the appropriation of Thomas Aquinas by certain 17th century Puritans. So it's a million miles away from the work embodied in the two books that have come out recently. One of the ironies is, if I die today, if I'm remembered for anything, it will be for the guy who wrote two books in areas that he's remarkably unqualified to write on. But in 2016, the local public school district where my wife and I live just outside Philadelphia, and where our own kids had gone through school, became the first school district in Pennsylvania to propose a transgender bathroom policy. And I was contacted by the husband of one of the women who taught at the school. They were friends of ours, devout Roman Catholics. He was a lawyer, and he asked if I would draft a letter with him to the school board in order to raise awareness of what was going on in the schools. My own kids had graduated by that point. They were taking out what I considered to be somewhat courageous stands in college because of their faith, and I therefore felt it fell on me as their father to take what was a relatively safe stand. So the gentleman and I drafted a letter. I fronted it because obviously his name could not be on the letter because it would have placed his wife in professional jeopardy. You can actually find the letter at First Things. I ultimately posted it at First Things. The striking thing about the letter, and the thing that revolutionized me or radicalized me on this, is perhaps not what you'd think. It's not that I got huge pushback from progressives in the township. It's that I couldn't get anybody to pay attention at all, not even the parents. Nobody could see that this was a significant issue affecting parental rights, affecting children's education, women's sports, etc., etc., etc. And that got me interested in the topic of why is it that the sentence, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," has come to make intuitive sense to so many people. I expect it to make sense to people who've sat in Judith Butler's postgraduate gender theory seminars. Why was it making intuitive sense to friends and neighbors? Why, for example, my wife and I chatting to friends recently whose son and daughter-in-law are expecting a child, and they're going to give the child a gender-neutral name so the child can decide for themselves their gender in a couple of years' time. And it was that intrigued me. And so I started to explore the issue. And that's where the two books came from. The first larger book was an attempt to get at this issue. And my Reformation training came in helpful, I suppose, because one of the things you learn as a historian is nothing is the cause of itself. And everything is ineradicably complicated. And so what I wanted to do was probe into the background of why this sentence had become plausible. And to summarize rather simplistically my thesis was this: that over the last 500 years, we've come to grant increasing authority to our inner space, to our inner feelings. It's not that human beings have never had inner feelings before. If you read the Iliad, Achilles sulks, he has an inner space. What is different is that we grant an authority to our inner feelings in terms of our identity. Secondly, I noticed a turn, really, I think, beginning in the middle of the 19th century. Aaron will no doubt be far more competent than me to comment on this, but culminating really in the work of Sigmund Freud, which started to see those inner feelings as primarily driven by sexual desire. And the third phase, that we had, if you like, the psychologizing of the self, the sexualizing of psychology. The third phase, which is inevitable, I think, after the second. As soon as people begin to define themselves by their inner desires, by their psychological states, those psychological states must inevitably become political. We have the profound politicization of sexual desire in the latter part of, well, it begins in the 1930s and it explodes in the late 1950s, going on through the 1960s. What interested me was that did not simply help me understand why the sentence, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," had come to make sense. It also explained to me why a whole heap of other things that are going on are happening. I was intrigued by the fact that the world that I grew up in I went to university in the 1980s. I learned to love history at the feet of a card-carrying Marxist historian. He wrote my reference for my doctoral program. I, as a non-Marxist, enjoyed a very cordial relationship with him. My best friend on faculty back in the UK at the two universities I taught at was a Trotskyite. I was left wondering why such friendships didn't seem to exist anymore, and while differences in opinion became very personal. I have to say, with my Trotskyite friend, he did used to say to me that when the revolution came, he would have to have me shot. But he always stressed that that was merely because the dialectics of history demanded it, and it was nothing personal against me. But I was intrigued that when I talked about my friendships like that with young students, they didn't have any clue about what I was talking about. I remember one person coming up to me and saying, "How could you be friends with somebody like that?" And of course, the psychologizing of the self, what it tends to do, of course, is it means that we all identify ourselves with our ideas. And therefore, those who disagree with our ideas are fundamentally denying who we think we are. And so this model, I think, started to take on a life of its own in my mind in terms of explaining a whole heap of other things that are happening. The smaller book, by the way, yesterday I did a book signing, they forgot to advertise it, so nobody turned up. But I appreciated the looks of pity of people as they walked past me sitting at the table. I felt like, is it Tiny Tim in Christmas Carol says that maybe if I stand in the church with my crutch, it will make people feel how blessed they are that they are not me. I will be signing some books afterwards. I think we're giving them away, so you don't even have to buy. There was one person came up, looked at the book, put it down. I thought, man, I can't even give my book away. It's so. Anyway, that's just a personal plug. Please, if nothing else, help me feel a little bit better about myself today than yesterday. But the shorter book derived, first of all, from Ryan Anderson. Asked me if I would do a short book that he could give to staffers in D.C. But once I'd done, the shorter books come out and are sold pretty well. One of the things that struck me after the big book came out and then after the short book was I never anticipated how many people would want to speak to me about the transgender issue. I was writing the book really just as a way out of interest, trying to explain what was going on. Between 2015 and 2020-21, the transgender issue has absolutely exploded. I expected most families to be touched by the L, the G, and the B. I'm staggered at the number of families that have been touched by the T. It's if you haven't read Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, I think it's a must read. I bought it and I waited 2 months to read it because I knew it would be incredibly depressing. If you haven't read Abigail Favale's The Genesis of Gender, it's on the book table out in the main, outside the main lecture hall. I would say that's a brilliant must-read book. The T is becoming a real scourge. And one of the things I found with the reception of the small book is so many families are struggling with this and are looking for things that are accessible to help them address it. So I would urge you, if you don't want to read my book, that's fine, but please, if you're involved in pastoral ministry or even if just connecting with friends, make sure that you're reading some material on this that will allow you to understand what is going on. I think I'll close there and hand over to Aaron.
You should also read Carl's book. Start with the short one and then graduate to the longer one. So Carl, the historian, gave us the intellectual and social history of how we got to the point where that sentence made sense. I'm going to pretend to be the prophet and tell you what's coming next. So if you went to my talk last night, you might have had nightmares, and my portion this morning is probably not going to console you. So what do you mean, what comes after transgenderism? How could we sort of proceed down this road any further? I would suggest to you that the transgender movement, which purports to be a civil rights struggle, which claims to be about people that struggle with gender dysphoria and conflicted inner feelings, is actually something else, something more radical and more ambitious. People with gender dysphoria, who indeed are suffering, are not the real issue here. They're, I think, merely kind of useful instrument for a larger agenda. Carl talks about a feminist writer, Simone de Beauvoir. I'm probably saying her name wrong. You could distill her claims down to the following statement: that the most authentic human self is that which is most detached from biology and from society. Now, how do we achieve this detachment from biology and from society? We achieve the detachment from biology through advanced technologies. We achieve the detachment from society through a kind of cultural revolution. Ground zero was, of course, decoupling sex from reproduction, and indeed reproduction from the body. So the technological changes of the sexual and social changes of the sexual revolution that brought us contraception and abortion and now surrogacy and IVF and so forth. But again, I think that was only the beginning of a more comprehensive, more total revolution. To become transgender is not just a lifestyle choice. It's not just a kind of medical correction. Transgenderism is the latest manifestation of a long struggle to liberate ourselves from nature itself, from the limits of human biology, through technology and through social change. What is the logical endpoint of this entire process. Some prominent transgender advocates are not shy about naming it. Take, for example, Martine, formerly Martin Rothblatt, a billionaire male-to-female businessman. In his 2011 book, From Transgender to Transhuman, Rothblatt spells out the destination for us. Transgenderism, he says, is the on-ramp to transhumanism. What is transhumanism? Transhumanists represent a kind of new species of academics and activists and visionaries. These folks aim to use technology not just to alter our lived environment, the world out there, but to fundamentally alter human nature itself. The goal is to upgrade or enhance human beings through biotechnology. Rothblatt and other transhumanists are quite open about their ultimate dream, which is to liberate ourselves from the body entirely. I'm going to say more about that in just a moment. Any objection to this project, you will not be surprised to hear, is a form of bigotry. This one is known as fleshism. If you think human beings ought to remain in our bodies, lest you think that Rothblatt is merely a sort of fringe kook that's written a strange book, which, you know, billionaires are allowed to do, I'll introduce you to another thinker, a man named Yuval Harari. He's a professor of history at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His best-selling books have sold over 20 million copies, which is, you know, no small shakes. And more importantly, he's one of the darlings of the World Economic Forum. He's a key architect of their global agenda. His 2018 WEF lecture, Will the Future Be Human?, was sandwiched between an address from German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron. So he's playing in the sandbox with the big dogs. In that lecture, Harari explained that in coming generations, we will learn how to engineer our bodies and brains and minds, gene editing, nanotechnology, and so forth, such that these will become the main products of the 21st century economy, not textiles and vehicles and weapons and things like that, but bodies, brains, and minds. Human beings, after all, in his oft-repeated phrase, human beings are hackable animals. With his audience at Davos warmed up by this teaser, Harari then waxes to a kind of crescendo. Quote, "This will not just be the greatest revolution in the history of humanity. It will be the greatest revolution in biology since the beginning of life 4 billion years ago." Which is, of course, a pretty big deal, I guess. The reason is because for billions of years, nothing fundamental changed in the basic rules of life. All of life, he says, for 4 billion years, dinosaurs, amoebas, tomatoes, humans, all of life was subject to the laws of natural selection and to the laws of organic biochemistry, but not anymore. This is all about to change. Science, he says, is replacing evolution by natural selection with evolution by intelligent design. Not the design of some god above in the cloud, but our intelligent design and the design of our clouds, the IBM cloud, the Microsoft cloud. These are the new driving forces of evolution. At the same time, science, he says, may enable life, after being confined for 4 billion years to the limited realm of organic compounds. Science may enable life to break out into the inorganic realm. Now, what is he talking about with this last sentence? Life breaking out into the inorganic realm. It's been a transhumanist dream since the dawn of modern computing that someday we will be able to upload the informational content of our brains or our minds, if you believe in minds, into some sort of massive computing system or digital cloud or other technological repository capable of storing massive amounts of information. On this weirdly dualist, kind of materialist view of man, we will have no more need of a human body, which, after all, always fails us in the end. So by shedding this mortal coil, this organic dust that always returns to dust, we'll find the technological means to actually live forever. Living forever in the digital cloud or the mainframe computer constitutes the transhumanists' eschatology, salvation by digital technology and by social revolution. Now, of course, this project is physically and metaphysically impossible. We're an inextricable unity of material body and spiritual soul that can only be separated by death. But set that aside for now. I think it's interesting to look at what this eschatological dream tells us about the transgender movement, which, the transhumanist movement, which represents, I'm arguing, the continued logic of the transgender movement. These flights of fancy clearly indicate that transgenderism and its cousin, transhumanism, is a kind of religion. It's a particular type of a neo-Gnostic religion. It's reviving ideas that are actually very old and that Christianity contended with in the first centuries of the church. And I think that helps explain why these ideologies attract educated, wealthy, powerful, and culturally influential adherents today. The reason is that they tap into a kind of religious longing. They tap into deeply religious aspirations that are ineradicable. Our heart is restless until it rests in God. So if it doesn't rest in Him, it will attempt to find impoverished substitutes. The only problem there is that the fruits of any of those pursuits, the fruits of any of those substitutes, can ultimately only be dehumanizing. And we see that, of course, in the tragedy of the wreckage that transgenderism is causing in families and in individual lives. So with that, I'll close my remarks and we can open up the Q&A.
Can I just make one observation about what Aaron just said? If you've ever watched the Netflix series Black Mirror, watch it, because some of what Aaron is talking about is portrayed in a obviously dramatic way in the episodes of that series. It's quite striking. Not Christian by any means, but very striking, and it kind of shows you what might be coming and certainly how some people are thinking.
So where we are seems uniquely Western, and the historian, especially on topics like the Reformation and Enlightenment, could illuminate whether this is sort of the end result of the elevation of self and subjectivism and certain things, or whether that's not the case. But it seems like this is only currying favor, really, in the West, right? This is something that most of the rest of the world looks at and just thinks we've all lost our minds. Do you see anything that says otherwise? Do you see this currying favor in traditional Muslim countries or places where there's still a healthy sense of submission to something other than one's own feelings?
It's an interesting question. When I wrote my book, I certainly thought it was a Western narrative, that I made no claims that it would work in. It seems to me there are various forms of modernity out there. China, India, Russia, they all represent different forms of modernity. And I think when I was writing my book, I'm thinking of America and Western Europe. Interestingly enough, I've started to get correspondence from some Muslims recently. Now, as far as I can tell, they're Muslims who are based in the West. So they're Islamic communities that are facing challenges posed in a particularly Western way. I wonder long-term, though, whether the notion of different kind of modernities will prove sustainable, given technology, given the way that countries are now, well, the economy is globalized, but also the imagination of people is increasingly globalized. I was struck in 2020 that there were riots in Britain relative to events in Minneapolis. At the same time that the Chinese government were cracking down on dissidents in Hong Kong. Now, I'm old enough to have watched as an adult. I remember watching it on the television, the handing over of Hong Kong to the Chinese authorities in 1997, and seeing the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook get onto the little boat launch and sail across the horizon. It struck me as fascinating that Hong Kong means nothing to the British imagination relative to events that are happening in the United States. So the answer to your question, I think, is it really depends upon how the internet and information technology and social media reshape the global imagination. And I don't know how that will go.
Yeah, I think aside from some indigenous cultures that are, still very close to those roots, for whom this would be entirely foreign, the world is very much westernized. Transgenderism itself can take slightly different forms, and there can be different motivations in different cultures. So actually, before this exploded in the West, for several years, there has been a phenomenon of a few men in Islamic countries doing a sort of male to female transition, motivated probably by living under a law that does not permit homosexuality. These are people with same-sex attractions who want to live out a relationship with another man. And actually, it's permissible in that society to do so if you have a so-called sex change operation. But again, I think Carl's right that the influence of the West and the distribution of the flow of information and sort of cultural products from the West to really the entire world is having a kind of homogenizing effect. And so, yes, it's a Western phenomenon, but the West is global now in some sense.
You're painting an interesting picture, a development from where we come from the West and this inner self and having this authority to transhumanism. And I'm wondering whether that story is so straightforward as it sounds, because the inner self requires us to take a step back from our embodiment, having this little out-of-body experience from which we can say this is the wrong body, for example, which doesn't make sense to a good Thomist, but it is a kind of a dualism, right? And it's a dualism of mind and matter, just in Descartes and so forth. But if you then go to transhumanism, I'm not quite sure it's the same picture, because transhumanism presupposes that we can upload ourselves into computers and that is all of one piece, basically. It's not dualistic, it's monistic, and it's materialism. That is, if we don't think that our mind is already reduced to the brain, we have no reason to think that we can upload ourselves in computers and it's the same thing, basically. And I think that comes out interestingly in Harari's book, Deus Homo, Homo Deus, that's what it is. So when I read this book, I thought, wow, this is really cynical, because I mean, what he's describing as dataism is not that human beings and the authority of their self are taken over, they are being taken over by dataism, but the data themselves, the stream of data, is the absolute subject here, and in a totally materialistic sense. And but the interesting thing is, I thought, well, this Harari is really cynical, and maybe he is, but in the last 2 pages of this book, he actually says, is this a good idea or is it not, basically? And you didn't think that's where he was going, but it tells you there is a conflictual kind of thing there too. They want this self at the same time as they say the transhumanist story will end quite differently. So I'm wondering whether there's a strategy there to get into their minds or to change their minds.
I think we could have an interesting conversation about the metaphysics. Is transhumanism materialistic purely, or is it dualistic? I think what it shares in common with transgenderism is something that goes back to Karl Marx and the early works of Karl Marx, which is a radical rejection of any form of dependence, right, on God particularly, or on anything higher. That was Marx's starting point. If I'm going to be free, then I cannot be dependent on another. That was basically his axiomatic starting point. Atheism was a postulate, it wasn't a conclusion of his system. And the corollary of that radical rejection of any form of dependence was a notion that I have to create myself. So self-creation seems central to the transgender project, right? The givenness of my body is not something that I can accept, and through both technology and a societal change, because this requires that other people recognize and affirm what I have done to myself or what the surgeon did to me. I can remake myself, you know, ex nihilo. And it seems to me that the transhumanists are wanting to move in the same direction. So before you get to uploading yourself into the computer, you get to, we're going to recreate ourselves as a new species. And you know, the technological changes that we can visit upon the body through, mostly through biotechnology, cybernetics and so forth, will make it such that human beings will be so different from what they are now that they will be an entirely new species, perhaps one that becomes dominant over people that have not engaged in that project. So I think the common thread is going to be the idea of a radical rejection of dependence that entails self-creation, because I cannot be dependent on the created order as it now stands, which is also what makes it akin to the ancient Gnostics, who saw the material created order as oppressive and something that needed to be transcended.
I have a quick question before we go to the audience. I mean, I'm very interested, and by the way, that Yuval Harari book is really terrific. It's scary, the Homo Deus. But I'd like Carl to explain how we get from a point where the pill liberates us to have a whole lot of sexual pleasure without all the inconveniences of children to, well, we don't need sex at all, basically. You know, we can do whatever we want, and sex is simply an incarnational problem that gets in the way of the kind of future that we really want. I mean, how do we do that in 60 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think there's no single cause for that. I think pornography plays a powerful role in this. Mark Regnerus's book, I think Erica cited it yesterday in her talk, Cheap Sex, which makes the point that pornography, particularly for young men, provides them with enough sexual pleasure. Maybe it's not as good as the real thing, but it's close enough for them not to have to bother putting in any effort. I mean, I talk to students, I say, you know, in the 19th century, let's just say you're a teenage guy and you want to sleep with a girl. Not an unusual thing for a teenage guy to want to do. But what have you got to do at that place? You've got to have a job. You've got to be clean. You've got to make an effort to sell yourself both to the girl and to her family, because there are going to be significant consequences when you sleep together. It's going to create a baby. It's going to create lifelong commitment. Once you sever, once you make sex safer, none of that applies anymore, and the standards required, if you like, start to dramatically drop. When you introduce pornography into the equation, you destroy any need for personal relationship whatsoever. So I think pornography plays a significant part in that. I think there's a strand of feminism. I recently read Sophie Lewis's book, Full Surrogacy Now, that's fascinating. She's wrestling there with a very serious issue that I think needs to be addressed, and that is, you know, what is the status of surrogate mothers in our society, legally, philosophically, etc. The answer she comes up with is crazy. The answer is not that we ban surrogacy, but that we get rid of natural motherhood, so that everybody's a surrogate mother at that point. And again, I think that plays into the narrative that you're pointing to, Fran. What interests me in all this is, and to go to the brothers, sort of touch back on the brothers' question, I think we intuitively know this is nonsense. I mentioned yesterday in my talk, we know that a slap in the face is very different to a sexual assault. We know that if Harvey Weinstein had been selling roles in his movies to young women who allowed him to stick his finger in their ear, we would regard him as a weirdo, but we would not regard him as quite the monster we do, because we intuitively know that sex is more powerful it's more significant. It cannot be reduced to the level of a mere recreation. So again, touching on your question, Fran, as the pill and as contraception press sex towards being a mere recreation, in fact, we intuitively know it isn't that. And that's going to create problems and conflicts and tensions and contradictions.
So my question is, the issue really is one of reality versus lack of reality. At least I'm pretty sure this is a lack of reality that this is going to happen. And then I think the key thing politically is we have to develop the language that we can use to kind of counter this political attack that's going on. And it's a tsunami of a political attack. You can't stand up in the universities or generally, or even in academia, as you know, Aaron, against this. Because I think we don't have the words or the language to say, hey, this is not real. I think we all know from Tim Gray's talk last year, whenever you deal in falsehoods and lack reality, it always ends in violence, and that's the end game. So I think what happens when this reality is not checked, or this lack of reality irreality is not checked, the end game is a horrible violence that will occur, akin to a Maoist type of thing. So I guess my question is, do you really think this is a problem of reality versus not reality? And do you have any thoughts about words or concepts that can be developed over time to fight this?
Well, I definitely think it's an attempt to assert an unreality over what is real. And that's where I think you get these interesting, the hashtag #MeToo movement. I think it raised some very interesting and important points, but it fascinated me that it emerged from Hollywood. Hollywood is the principal source of regarding sex as cost-free recreation. And suddenly they realized, no, it isn't quite as cost-free as we thought. And that's a good example to me of where unreality at some point has to face reality, that conflicts and contradictions emerge from this. Second part of your question, the sort of the apologetic question, I think we have to tell stories. I think you could sit and argue with somebody about the transgender issue till you're blue in the face and get nowhere. I think what we need is more and more, sadly, tragic stories of people who've transitioned and now want to transition back. If you've seen the Matt Walsh documentary, I Am a Woman, to me, there were two terrifyingly memorable players in that movie. One of them was the trans surgeon, who just struck me as an evil monster. There's no other word for it. She's an evil monster. The second was the woman who transitioned to being a man and now regrets it and wants to transition back. I think we live in an age where people's thinking on this issue is not shaped by arguments. Yet we need the philosophy, we need the solid metaphysical grounding, but to win over public opinion, we need powerful stories and we need to get them out and pressed on the public imagination. It struck me again, the first day I was here, the sister who gave the talk on her work with persuading women not to have abortions. What was so powerful about her address was the stories she told. So I think we need intellectuals working on the philosophical side of it, but at ground level, we need stories. We need to appeal to the heartstrings.
We have time for just a couple other questions. Yes, Bishop?
I was going to ask a question, but Aaron, did you ever respond?
Oh, I was just going to say, I like to say that reality and human nature always bat in the bottom of the ninth inning. So you can pretend that the world is not as it is for a while, and you can game that for a while. But eventually reality is going to push back. So, I mean, the sexual revolution, at least certain aspects of it, not pornography, but interpersonal behavioral aspects of it, could come to a grinding halt just by reaching the limits of what medicine can do to clean up the messes that we make. So a strain of antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea is not outside the realm of possibility. And that could radically change our understanding of permissive sexual behavior. So, and I think this ties into your answer too about the story. Stories of people who have actually been harmed are going to speak more powerfully than abstract arguments about reality.
Carl, I wanted to ask a quick question about this idea of intuition you talked about last time, because, yeah, it seems like intuition naturally, and especially us as Christians, we understand, oh, this goes against the natural order of things. But it seems like our society is accelerating so fast that intuition's being steamrolled.
Yeah.
Because you see, like 1973, abortion was legalized in the U.S., and then you look at where we are today, and it's like shout your abortion.
Yeah.
And you look in 2015 when gay marriage was legalized on a federal level, and
Yeah.
over 50% of people disagreed with the idea of gay marriage, and now we have Pride Month.
Yeah.
You know, and the transgender movement is moving so quickly here. It just seems like we're accelerating at a faster and faster pace towards transhumanism or whatever comes after transhumanism. And I'm wondering, like, at what point can we backpedal
Yeah.
as a society to get back to where intuition takes control? And at what point do we kind of say, like, well, Matthew 24, as in the days of Noah, and, you know, like, we're approaching the end times pretty quickly here.
Yeah, very good question. I think a couple of things come to mind. One, I think it's a battle for the imagination. It can't simply be won by argument. And that's where I think Christianity has a strong hand to play, because the faith is not simply about a set of doctrinal propositions. It's about worship. It's about a liturgy. It's about Presbyterians do have liturgy, by the way. It's about shaping the imagination in intuitive ways. I mean, I preached for many years. I can't remember many sermons I preached, but let alone ones I've heard. But it's like learning a language. I did Latin. I did classics. I don't remember a single Latin class I took at school. But you give me a piece of Latin, I can read it. I must have been there. My mind's been shaped. But I think the incremental impact of worship. The first thing that Christians need to do is make sure that our intuitions are shaped correctly and the intuitions of our children are shaped correctly. Then I think we need to be modest, because it's a problem of imagination and the moral imagination of society. Simply electing the right person to Congress or the right person to the Supreme Court is not going to change it. It's good to get the right people in those positions. It's a great thing, but it's not going to solve the problem overnight. So the second thing I would say is we need to refocus ourselves on the local. I can't transform the United States, but I can have an impact in the street I live. I can have an impact in the classrooms where I teach. My wife and I, one of the things we love to do at Grove is we open our house for hospitality regularly for students. I got the dates wrong once. We had, I think, 50 or 60 students turn up at our house for desserts one evening when I got the dates confused. But we love to do that because we want to shape the intuitions of the kids in the college. We want them to remember things about the college that weren't taught in the classroom. So I would say it's a battle of the intuitions. And let's not start at a grand scale of say, how do we change the intuitions of America? Let's think about how we change the intuitions of our families, our loved ones, the streets where we live, the places where we work. That's where we can have a significant impact, precisely because so much of what is our intuitions is shaped by the immediate interpersonal and social environment in which we find ourselves.
Bishop Carey, you had a question.
There's two words in the Christian imagination that seem to have to do with this discussion. We haven't heard them yet, heaven and hell. And from your description of the transhumanist vision, it sounds to me like a description of hell, and that is that radical solitude, radical aloneness. What is that? What is there possibly to arouse an imaginative desire for such a world? I'm thinking, as I say that, of another alternative that's very much at play here now, and that is suicide. That if I'm going to have to go to hell, I guess I'll choose it on my terms and not on my master's terms. But I was wondering what is you might say, the eschatological vision of all this thing?
So I think radical atheism is very, very hard to live practically, and just to exist believing that when I die I'm going to disappear into nothing, right? And very few people can do that. Friedrich Nietzsche, ended his life in an insane asylum, perhaps because he couldn't sustain his vision of life in the future. So I think that's why people do reach for substitute religions. And if your premise is I create reality, I create my own reality, which is isolating and solipsistic. But that's not enough. So I have to attempt to create or dream about some way to make the hereafter. Technologically, they recognize that we're not there yet. So many of these people, there are several companies now that will put you into a deep freeze, which is a kind of weird form of annihilation and self-destruction and suicide. But the idea is, you know, who knows who's going to do this, but somebody in the future is supposed to wake me up when we have the technology to, you know, upload my brain into the computer so that when my body finally fully fails, I won't just disappear into the void. And people do this. I think it's, well, I looked at the cost structure was, I think just you can freeze your entire body for maybe 150,000, and it would cost less if you just wanted to freeze your head. Not kidding. Read. People do that already, actually. Right. C.S. Lewis saw this all coming. He wrote a novel called That Hideous Strength. That describes, this was 60 years ago, that described this kind of project.
Just it's almost tangential, but I've been reflecting on it. I'm not quite sure what to make of it yet, but I wonder if all of this could be seen as a war against mortality anyway. Transgenderism seems to me to be a war against the body. And what is the most significant thing about the body? Well, as Aaron's just said, it fails us at some point. And maybe that's the apologetic moment as well, because your body, you may not give it the last word on your gender, but it will have the last word on your existence. So I wonder, I think, Bishop, you're onto something there by connecting this to questions of mortality and immortality. I wonder if this whole thing is a terror of death and a war against mortality.
Folks, we're out of time here, but just a couple of final comments. For the best line I've heard in the last year is reality batting in the bottom of the ninth. I am.
You need to translate that for an Englishman.
I mean, Aaron, I am going to steal that, believe me, and I hope all of you do too. Second of all is, this is the book Carl's written. It's really, really good. There's another thing that you ought to be aware of, that the larger book, which is also superior, Carl has that in audiobook form, and we listened to it coming back from Notre Dame last year, and it's just terrific. He narrates it. It's a great job. The final thing is that all this conversation, I mean, Aaron's forthcoming book, his comments, Carl's book now, really these things take on particular gravity when you reread C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. I mean, he was an incredible prophet of what was coming, and this was back in what, Carl, like the 40s?
No, it's the 80th anniversary next year.
Yeah. So thank you for being here. Both these gentlemen have books either out or coming out, and they're really, really, really worth getting. So thanks very much.